Everyone. So I'm back again with another video, and today we'll learn about authentication and authorization. We'll see what is authentication, what is authorization, and what is the difference between these. So let's begin. So today's agenda is to learn about what is authentication, what is authorization, and authentication versus authorization. So let's start. So authentication and authorization might sound familiar, but they are distinct security process in the world of identity and access management, which is also called in short from IAM. Authentication confirms that users are who they say they are, and authorization gives those users permissions to access a resource. Now, what is authentication? See in detail. Authentication is the act of validating that users are whom they claim to be. This is the first step in any security process. Here, user complete an authentication process through password or one-time PIN or authentication app or biometrics. The username and password are the most common authentication factor. If a user enters the correct data, the system assumes the identity is valid and grant access. In one-time PIN, grant access for only for one session or transaction. Now there are some authentication apps such as Google Authenticator, which generates security code via an outside party that grant access. Biometrics, a user presents a fingerprint or eye scan to gain access to the system. In some instances, system requires the successful verification of more than one factor before granting access. This multi-factor authentication requirement is often deployed to increase security beyond what password alone can provide. Now we'll see what is authorization. Authorization in a system security is the process of giving the user permissions to access a specific resource or functions. This term is often used interchangeably with access control or client privilege. Giving someone permission to download a particular file or on a server or providing individual users with some administrative access to an application are good examples of authorization. In secure environments, authorization must always follow authentication. Users should first prove that their identities are genuine before an organization's administrator grant them access to the requested resource. Now, authentication versus authorization. We'll see what is the difference. Despite the similar sounding term, authentication and authorization are separate steps in the login process. Understanding the difference between the two is the key to successfully implementing an IAM solution. Let's use an analogy to outline the difference. Consider a person walking up a locked door to provide care to a pet while family is away on vacation. That person needs authentication in terms of a key. The lock on the door only grants access to someone with the correct key in much the same way that the system only grants access to users who have access who have the correct credential. Authorization in form of permissions. Once inside the the person has the authorization to access the kitchen and open the cupboard that holds the pet food. The person may not have permission to go into the bedroom for a quick nap. Authentication and authorization work together in this example. A pet sitter has the right to enter the house, which is authentication, and once there, they have access to certain areas only, which is called authorization. So, what does it do? Authentication verifies the credentials, whereas authorization grants or denies permissions. And how does it work? So, in case of authentication, it works through password, biometrics, one-time PIN, or apps. In case of authorization, through setting maintained by security team. Whether it is visible to user in case of authentication, yes, and authorization, it's visible, no. And is it changeably by the users? Authentication, yes, and authorization, no. How does data move? In case of authentication, it moves through ID token, and in case of authorization, it's through access tokens. System will implement these concepts in the same way, so it's crucial that IAM administrator understand how the both will be utilized. For example, authentication lets every staff member access your workplace system if they provide the right ID credential in the response to your chosen authentication requirement. Authorization grant permission to a department a specific file and reserve access to confidential data such as financial information as needed. which ensures that the employee have access to the files they need to do their job. Understand the difference between authentication and authorization and implement IAM solutions that have strong support for both. You will protect your organization against data breaches and enable your workforce to be more productive. In short, access to a resource is protected by both authentication and authorization. If you cannot prove your identity, you won't be allowed into a resource. And even if you can prove your identity, if you are not authorized for that resource, you will still be denied access. Authentication determines whether users are who they claim to be, and authorization determines what users can do and cannot access. Authentication challenges the user to validate credentials, for example, through password, answers to security question, or facial recognition. Authorization verifies whether access is allowed through policies and rules. Authentication is usually done before authorization. Authorization usually done after successful authentication. Authentication generally transmits info through an ID token. Authorization generally transmits info through an access token. Authentication generally governed by the OpenID Connect protocol, whereas authorization generally governed by the OAuth framework. The example of authentication is employees in a company are required to be authenticated through the network before accessing their company email. And the example of authorization is after an employee successfully authenticated, the system determines what information the employer are allowed to access. So thank you viewers for watching the video, and if you think that video is helpful and informative, do like the video and subscribe the channel. And if you have not watched our previous videos, please go and watch the videos, and if videos are helpful, do like the videos and subscribe the channel. This is Jiten from Software Circle, and here we advocate for free learning. Thank you so much for watching.